Welcome to this Talks Live from Marsden Jacob Associates. Today we're going to be talking about the economics of coastal zone management. And so we'll start with the acknowledgement of country. Marsden Jacob acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. We pay our respects to their ancestors and elders, past and present, and leaders emerging. I'll start with introductions. I'm Philippa Short. I'm an economist in the Perth office and I work across a range of issues, across a number of sectors as well. Environment, natural resource and waste are my main areas, but we do a lot. With me is Rod Carr. He's a director in our Sydney office and he works across an extensive array of areas and issues, as you can see from our blurbs on the screen, which are also available on our website if you really want to track us down. So, I think the question is, why are we doing this topic and why are we doing it now? And climate change is the big one. That's really what this is all about. We've seen sea levels are starting to rise and we are starting to see more extensive and frequent inundation of lower lying areas that come with that sea level rise. There's also been erosion of cliffs, beaches, foreshores, and extensive damage is caused to infrastructure which are close to those. And it's not just buildings, it's jetties, it's roads, public land, it's private land, so it impacts whole communities. Along with climate change, we've seen more frequent and extensive storm events, and this causes flooding of lands and buildings, along with inundation and erosion and the associated damage. Flooding also leads to extensive pollution as sewers overflow and debris gets washed down rivers into the sea. It's not just stakeholders' land that is threatened, there are environmental threats that come with that. Beaches clearly erode, but as debris is washed down from river to sea, we see changes in salinity, we see nutrient and sediment loads changing, and this all leads to a host of problems, particularly habitat changes and species loss. There are also social impacts on heritage sites, particularly Indigenous heritage sites, which often lie along waterways, and these get lost with flooding. The second one is economics is complex. It's always complex. There's no two coastal zones are the same. Things change within kilometres of each other, and Australia has a lot of coast to deal with, as we know. It's therefore an issue that's not just a national issue, it impacts state and it impacts particularly locally. And so what we're trying to do is apply analytical frameworks so that the approach that we use provides the best outcome for the specific local community and balances social, economic and environmental risks and benefits. There has been some movement in these areas. States are starting to produce guidelines for risk and adaptation management, but it's still in its infancy, and we'll be talking about that a bit. So before we start proper, we've done a little movie to show why we are here today.
It's happening before our eyes, metres of prized coastline being dragged into the sea. Wamberal Beach on the state's central coast are sitting duck. Overnight, these million-dollar views became a multi-million-dollar mess.
Behind me, the 8 houses on Collaroy Beach that have been significantly damaged. It only took 3 hours on Sunday night for these properties to lose 15 metres of their front yards, including beachfront swimming pools, which were washed down onto the beach and into the ocean.
This daycare centre in Newcastle had to be torn down last year because beach erosion had made it unsafe. And experts say there are tens of thousands of other buildings at risk in Australia.
So as you can see, there's lots and lots of issues emerging with coastal events, coastal erosion events, as we get wild storms coming through along the coastlines of Australia. And this is really a national issue that we're facing. And some entities and local governments and state governments are looking to deal with it and grapple with the issue. All of us are faced by it in terms of the importance of the coastline to us and the impacts that these are presenting for us. Why us, and why is Marsden Jacob involved in this sort of space? This is one of those sort of really wicked and challenging problems that we like grappling with as an organisation. And we made a bit of investment into this a few years ago, where we actually started grappling with the fact that we needed to be able to integrate something that has an uncertain situation. So it's probabilistic in its nature. So probabilistic hazards were being modelled by the coastal zone hydrologists. And we went, okay, well, we can probably integrate that into an economic model. And we wanted to do that because then we could understand who benefits, how do the benefits distribute, is a solution welfare generating or not in terms of the options, and then starting to inform the thinking about actually how do we actually grapple with this problem, because at the end of the day, it's going to need to be funded. It's going to take funding resources. So a couple of things that we've been working on that we're going to talk to you about today is we've been developing what we tend to term best practice approaches to assessing the costs and benefits of coastal hazards on built assets, on land values, on amenity, and the importance of actually accurately and effectively integrating the probabilistic hazard modelling in a manner that actually enables you to have an informed decision situation. Now, one of the things that's really important in this, economics is a decision support tool. But it's part of the decision-making processes and the guidelines that are being adopted around the strait, such as the guidelines that are being adopted recently in Western Australia. During the webinar, we're going to set out some of the frameworks and analytical approaches that we've been using and developing to grapple with this pretty complex challenge. We're going to share some of our thoughts. We're also going to talk about some of the pitfalls that have emerged that we've witnessed in previous projects. So we'll hopefully take you on a bit of a journey in terms of economics. We'll hopefully make it interesting for you, because this is a really visible issue. As you can see from the image on the slide, these are beaches that, you know, people go and visit, people go and live beside, people go and recreate at. And so understanding how you grapple with the challenges that are here and now, but all the modelling suggests is only going to get greater in the future, is going to be really, really important challenge for both private and public sectors. Coastal zone threats, as you would have seen from the video imagery before, are national. Across the videos that we were showing before, you could see that there's been massive erosion events in Wamberal, not too distant past. We've been seeing storm surges up in the Cairns region, and here's an example of what's happened in the city of Stirling in Western Australia, where there's been really, really significant erosion events occurring. When you're grappling with this sort of problem, there's lots of information, and it's really important to have a process, though, that you start working through to systematically look at this information. I'll hand back to you, Pip, to talk about the process.
Thanks, Rod. As Rod said, there is a process, and in fact, we've put risk treatment identification up as a key step, but there are actually some steps before that. And so prior to trying to look at what you believe is the most efficient risk treatment, first off, the context needs to be established, and then the risk identified. So why is this a risk? Why does it need to be solved? And then Rod talked about probability. What that really looks at is the vulnerability analysis. When do we think this is going to become a problem? Is it immediate? Is it 50 years? Is it 100 years? And when those probabilities have been determined, then we look at the risk treatment identification, and that is pretty much where your economics comes in. Initially, from step one, you can see that there might be a very large number of areas that need to be managed within this one zone and quite a large number of options. And it's just not feasible to do a full benefit analysis on all of those. So the first step is to take those and use a multi-criteria analysis to identify what you believe are the most important areas and what you think may be the most important options. No multi-criteria analysis is the same because no coastal zone will be the same. But just as an example, some of the criteria we would look to apply to these areas are effectiveness. What do we think the ability of this option to mitigate the risk that we've identified actually is? Will there be an environmental impact? Will it be a positive one? Will it be a negative one? You know, will a seawall cause problems for the sandbar, and therefore what we're trying to overcome is actually going to cause more problems than it's worth? Social impact. Are there heritage sites, European or Aboriginal, that are going to be impacted by this? Cost is clearly a big one. Capital as well as maintenance. And are there other economic effects? So are there local businesses that are going to benefit from this? Are there local businesses that will not benefit from this? And then future adaptability. This is a big one, and it's still quite difficult because we know that science always changes, and we also know that the options for dealing with some of the problems may well change. And so you don't want to implement something that is then going to limit your options in the future. So that really is applied, and hopefully from that you will fall out some really obvious options that you think are going to be the most effective, and then you can carry out a cost benefit on these to identify which ones and rank which ones are going to be the most effective in developing those. So, sorry, Rod, I had one more, which was step 4. That's adaptation pathways. And that one is, once your cost benefit is done, you have to identify how you're going to implement it. And that becomes the last stage after cost benefit. So what is a cost benefit analysis? That's the big one. It's basically an economic appraisal. It's a term which gets used all the time. Some people love, some people hate. Triple bottom line. And it just means that we have to try and assess the financial value, the social value, and the economic value for not just the immediate area, but wider areas, community areas. We look at the base case, which is sometimes called business as usual, but we tend to refer to here as the do nothing option. What is going to happen if we actually do nothing? And sometimes, not often, that's the best option. We then compare it with the other options. So we run a range of values across all of them and see where we rank, which is what Rod is going to talk about. And when we talk about values, we sort of look at the asset types that are under threat. So it's the obvious ones. It's infrastructure, so residential buildings, commercial buildings, roads, and then foreshores. Foreshores are tough, and we have to identify what the value of these are to communities versus the value to the wider community, the national community. Do you feel better because Cottesloe Beach in Perth is there, even if you live in New South Wales and never plan on visiting it? So yes, I will hand over to Rod.
Thanks, Pip. And this is what we've got here, and you've been talking through is sort of at a high level some of the key benefits and costs that you sort of are working through and grappling with as part of doing a cost benefit analysis. As Pip said, you're looking at valuing the impacts on private property, you're looking at the impacts on public infrastructure, but you'd also value natural assets in that as well. Standing can be really important in this as well, to your point, Pip, in terms of, what's the standing, what's the scale of the analysis? Are you looking at this at an LGA level, or are you looking at this at a state level? Because ownership of these assets can then become a really important consideration in that context, because they might not be locally owned, private or public assets. So that needs to be considered in the standing considerations of it. From a cost perspective, obviously, if you're going to build something, that's going to come at a cost. You need to also understand how long that's going to last for, but what sort of maintenance are you going to need to put in place to maintain the performance of your treatment measure, your revetment wall, your seawall, whatever it is you think you're doing, or are you looking at a retreat alternative? Equally though, if you put infrastructure on a beach, it can have impacts on the performance of the beach. So another cost category that you might need to think about in this is the impacts on coastal areas and the values associated with that, because people go there to enjoy themselves, go for a swim, get a suntan, hopefully responsibly with sun cream on. But the reality is that you've got to actually think about these values, and are they being adversely affected by what you're building? And what are the consequences of that as part of the analysis? Now, that's it at a high level, but the reality is when you're grappling with something like this, there's a lot of things that you need to be thinking about here. You need to be thinking about your market-related costs. So these are the things that you can value through a market measure. Things like the loss of land, damage of infrastructure, etc. Are there indirect markets as well, looking at property values or production impacts on businesses, or even disruption values? Equally, climate-related events, storm surges, coastal recession, etc., can also lead to non-market impacts occurring as well. Things that are easier to value potentially, death, injury, environmental losses and the like. But equally, there are things like the amenity impacts, the health, the stress impacts that emerge, and also the disruption impacts that can emerge. Pip was talking before about complexity though, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the complexity that a practitioner in this space needs to grapple with. And this is an example of some of the options and the coastal hazard lines that have been developed up in the mid-north coast region of New South Wales. In this situation, they're thinking about the idea of construction of a seawall, which is your left-hand end that we're looking to protect a number of houses as well as road and other utility assets in that region. And the right-hand one shows you the percentage exceedance level at 2068 and how there are different hazard lines that present up that coastline and how they actually overlap differently depending on where you stand on the length of that road running down the length of the beach. So different houses are impacted in different ways, and different utility assets are impacted in different ways with different probabilities. So while the cost benefit analysis at the end of the day, you might end up with a table that's kind of simple like this. As Pip said, it's great if there's only a small number of options that you're looking at. This illustrative example, these are not real numbers, has 3 options in it, where you're building some things in some of them. In the last one, you're not building something, which could be like a planned retreat alternative. And then you're looking at what's your avoided cost. And in these ones, what you can see here is option 1 is preferred, because by putting in place the measure, which is a relatively low cost measure compared to options 2A and 2B, you're realizing effectively all of the benefit. And so this simplistic analysis would suggest that you should be going for option 1 in this circumstance. But here comes the complexity that you have to grapple with when you're doing something like this. And this is the reason as to why this is particularly complex. So what you can see in this progression of slides is that the probability of an impact basically is not constant through time. So year on year on year, the probability where each of these rows is, and this is an illustrative example, is a different asset, which could be an environmental asset or a built asset, has an emerging probability over time that changes. And so when you're faced with this situation, you've got a number of issues that you need to consider, and you need to be really careful. First of all, the probabilities are not constant. They change. And the key source of that is often climate change impacts where you've got sea level rise. Another consideration in this is that properties can be redeveloped. And if they put in place a different foundation structure, then their performance in the event of a coastal zone event can be quite different. So property on a traditional slab foundation, when it gets undercut, if the slab is compromised, the property is compromised. Whereas a property is built on piled assets that go a long way into the sand, then an undercut that occurs in the event of a storm event may not compromise and probably won't compromise the property and will mean that it will endure afterwards. Equally, the beach amenity is a dynamic consideration as well, because as we know, beaches don't have a constant amount of sand on them. The amount of sand goes, increments over time, then events occur, it goes out, and then it can build up again over time again. So we need to be really careful in thinking about what are the beach amenity considerations that emerge from both under the base case, but also under the option cases for it. And lastly on this list, just as some key things to consider, we really need to think carefully about edge effects as well. So when you build an asset, that's great, protects things. But what happens at the end of the asset? Is there a compromise that emerges at the end of the asset where you get edge effects occurring and whatever's on that end there actually gets impacted to some greater extent in the event of a storm event coming through? So these are some of the things you've got to grapple with, you've got to be really careful about. I'm going to talk about some of the pitfalls a little bit later, but what does economics help you to understand, Pip, in terms of the distribution of things and the distribution of outcomes?
Okay, so one of the things that we also then need to consider is who are the beneficiaries of any changes to the coastal zone management. And as this slide shows, it it's probably everybody, but it will be to a different degree. So governments, local, state, national, whichever is managing the local utilities, benefit. Clearly, local businesses and cafes. Sometimes there'll be private landholders, the local community and the broader community. And the broader community is what we were talking about earlier, where they may not use the beach, they may not be in this coastal zone, but it's the altruistic values that come with knowing it's there. So the way to identify a beneficiary is basically we identify the asset and then its use in our entire analytical framework. And so this then can help us break down who will benefit the most from this and which stakeholders really are the ones. It may be one stakeholder if it's just a private landowner, but as the pictures that Rod showed is generally there are a number of stakeholders who are going to benefit from any outcome. So we've used the term beneficiaries, but Rod did touch on it. It's not necessarily always a benefit. There can be a disbenefit. So a cost is that you have to consider if something goes in, it may negatively affect the local business. And so those are all, so therefore the local business lists in the stakeholders, but as a negative benefit. That's our note at the bottom about whether this proposed treatment is actually going to enhance or detract for some people. So then just as a brief summary on the next one is why this analysis is important. I hope that we've illustrated that already, but we know that coastal zones are being impacted and we know that that is just going to become more severe. It is about protecting current assets and infrastructure, but we also hope that by doing this now, we're planning for the future. It means that in the future, it's going to be easier to manage, perhaps not so many threats. There also needs to be flexibility around the planning now because science changes and hopefully our understanding will evolve. What we do with a cost benefit is that it attempts to ensure that the money that is spent on a solution is the best long-term outcome. If it's not the best long-term outcome, then we haven't done it properly, is how we feel. Importantly, the CBA also will identify the stakeholders who are benefited or not benefited. And so that the slide about risk treatment, that's the final step. The CBA can support the pathway that implements any options for adaptation. It identifies the beneficiaries, it evaluates what their individual share of the benefits will be, and that then feeds into what we've referred to as a benefit distribution analysis, because this analysis will then form the basis for any funding proposals that are needed and working out who's going to actually pay for the options and how much. So that then moves into your next stage, which we're not going to talk about, which is finding the right funding model. And that's important. However, as I touched on earlier, if we get it wrong, it's just meaningless. And I think Rod has seen a few of the issues and is going to talk through some of the problems.
Thanks, Pip. Yeah, so over the last several years, we've been involved in reviewing work that's been done in this space and economics that's been done in this space. And these are not universal issues, but these are some of the common issues that we've identified when this sort of analysis is being done. And the real problem is that they lead to meaningless results. So these sort of things can lead to you reaching a conclusion with a cost-benefit analysis that says do or don't do it. But actually, your cost-benefit analysis has a flaw in it. And that flaw means that the results just can't be relied upon or shouldn't be relied upon to support decision-making. Some of the issues that we've seen, errors in the probabilistic modelling. Now, this is not errors done by the coastal zone hydrologists. They're doing a great job. This is errors of interpretation into the economic analysis. So, for instance, the economic analysis is looking at the costs and benefits in every year for the term of the asset, which could be 50 plus years. But if, as I've seen previously, if someone's used cumulative probabilistic values rather than annual probabilistic values, then they're actually applying a cumulative value through time and valuing that in every single year. So they're dramatically overstating the potential benefit from an asset. And this can result in cost-benefit ratios that are 4, 5, 6 really big numbers that to me go, is there an issue here when I see them? But to the decision maker go, oh, awesome, that's obvious, we should do something. Errors in the cost valuation also occur. When do the costs present? Are they in year 1, 5, 10? You've got to be really careful interpreting in when the cost values need to come in to the analysis. Errors occur in the benefit valuation piece. So are you valuing every asset the same? As we were speaking about before, no, you can't, because assets are built differently. You can't value the impact on a traditional foundation asset the same as you would value the impact on an asset that's built on piles. But equally, you might actually also want to think about that in 50 years, which is a really long period of time, many of these houses will be redeveloped. And so does that mean that, if half of your assets there are on traditional foundations at the start of your analysis period and the other half are on piles already, what does that mean for the first half, those on traditional foundation? In all likelihood, a significant proportion of them are going to be redeveloped over that period of time. And the planning rules may require that they're actually built on piles foundations now. So you need to take that sort of thing into consideration in your analysis, reflecting the fact that houses are redeveloped. This is dynamic, which means that how you value those benefits through time will vary as well. This is a classic, but inclusion of wealth transfers in economics, bit of a techie one for us, but got to be really, really careful in economics. You are valuing economic costs and benefits, that you're not valuing something that is effectively a transfer between two different parties that have standing in the analysis. And then lastly, errors in the scope and scale of the analysis. So, let's say you're looking at one option that is a 100-metre long revetment and another option that is a 200-metre long revetment. We've got to adjust the scope of the assets that are actually protected by that revetment between those options. You've got to make sure that you're actually linking the assets that are gaining from the measure that you're doing, which could be nourishment, could be revetment, could be whatever, but you've got to be really careful and clear in going, which assets are actually going to benefit from this and which ones aren't. I've seen a few examples over the years where benefits have been attributed to properties that were not benefiting from the measure that was being put in place. Again, it overstates the benefit, unfortunately, of the measure that's being considered in terms of the analysis. So there's a range of challenges here that the practitioner just needs to think through carefully. And if they do, they can do a great piece of analysis. If they don't, and you see BCRs that are crazy high, that usually leads to having a closer look at things to check that there isn't some sort of issue emerging in terms of the analysis. Equally, if they're crazy low, you might want to look at that as well and go, hey, why is this so low? What's driving this? Am I undervaluing the benefits because I'm treating the probabilities the wrong way as well? A really important point in this sort of analysis, though, as well, is that this is a multidisciplinary effort. Unfortunately, when you're grappling with these sort of problems, this is not something that can necessarily be solved as one individual from one entity usually able to grapple with all the challenge. You're going to need input from coastal engineers, coastal hydrologists, social and environmental scientists, and the challenge that's presented for the economist here is actually trying to bring all this together. And so they need to have access to the different parties that are involved here. They need to have the ability to engage with them and check that they are interpreting in the analysis that they're being given into the economics appropriately. This is really, really important as part of the considerations. I think this is nearly the final slide. Yep. And this is just sort of doubling back to where we started in some ways. One of the reasons we're doing this is because we know that this is a national issue. We know that this is something that all tiers of government basically are grappling with at the moment. But equally, we know that engineering firms are, property development firms are, insurance organisations are, property owners are. And these issues are presenting in different ways depending on where you're located, both around the context of the Australian coastline, which is over 35,000 kilometres. It's a lot of coast around Australia, but also in each unique circumstance, depending on where assets are being built, depending on the shape and the directional facing of the beach or the coastline that you're talking about. There's a huge number of different variants basically happening here, which means that there's the ability to actually, want to harmonise the way the approaches are used and the analytical frameworks are used, but there's always going to be something unique, as Pip was saying before, about every circumstance. This is just a quick shout out. Pip and I are just two members of the team, and thanks Pip for leading this Talks Live presentation. But there's at least half a dozen of us across Marsden Jacob who are involved in this sort of analysis and enjoy the challenges that come from this sort of analysis. So our next Talks Live with Marsden Jacob is going to be in June 2023. If you miss any of our Talks Live webinars, please know they're recorded. So you can come back and jump on our website and grab a copy and have a look at what we've done at a time that suits you. Simply jump onto www.marsdenjacob.com.au/MJA Talks Live webinar. Thus far, we've done 6 Talks Live webinars that are up and live: valuing natural capital, simplifying water markets, constructing nature positive regulation impact statements, the European energy crisis, the real cost of carbon, and this one today, the economics of coastal zone management. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Pip, for leading us through.
Thanks, Rod.
We hope this has been helpful to you all, and thanks for your time.